In the late 1980s, an Indiana family thought they'd found their dream home, but what they discovered was an absolute nightmare. For years, the Johnsons were tormented by violent poltergeist activity and terrifying apparitions. It was a haunting so extreme that priests, psychics, and a television crew came to see it. But what they discovered wasn't just a haunted house, because to fight it, Doretta Johnson had to face something far more terrifying. Get ready for an astonishing story which I can't believe isn't better known. A case where other family members and others have gone on record to confirm that this really did happen just as Doretta said. It's all covered in her gripping book, The People in the Attic, and I just don't think this case has been covered in enough depth until tonight. Because I'm Peter Laws and you're about to step into the fog. The Johnson family had been living in Louisville, Kentucky. But in 1986, they moved to Madison, Indiana, and they loved it there. It was pretty, it felt safe. That was a big deal because Doretta had a troubled childhood, marked by danger and dysfunction, and she didn't want that for her kids. Ron, her husband, had a job nearby at the electrical plant, and so the area was perfect. They were renting a house on Allen Street in Madison, and things were great. But then one day in 1987, Ron came home, and in his hand was a real estate magazine. And he said, "Doretta, look at this." There was a house for sale on Clifty Drive in Madison. Doretta looked at the pictures and winced a little bit. The unpaved driveway, the messy lawn, and the unusual design. It wasn't a great first impression, but the more Ron talked, the more she could see the potential too. The home used to be a motel, the Windrift Motel to be exact, and it came with 2 acres of land. Now, Ron had wanted to start his own business for years, and they all knew that the area was really struggling with childcare facilities, and so they thought, hang on a minute, why not renovate this old motel? We could live in the house part, and we could make the motel section a daycare center. At $59,900, it was actually a bargain for that size and area. And hey, even if the business didn't work out, they could still do the place up and sell it on for a profit later. So Doretta was a little concerned with all the work that was needed, but she saw the thrill in Ron's eyes and thought, well, who knows? Maybe he's onto something. Let's go see it. So they drove out to Clifty Drive to see the house in the flesh, so to speak. And Doretta was a little discouraged at first, seeing it in real life. There was so much to do. In the book, she says, the house had a haggard, forsaken look. This wasn't an official real estate visit, though, so they couldn't get inside, but they had a look from outside, and they spotted, while they did so, a man walking up to the house. His name was Benny Cyrus. Benny and his family had lived there as managers of the motel before it was shut down, though they weren't the owners. And he told them that they had moved to a nearby home because, quote, we couldn't handle it anymore. Now, Doretta assumed he was referring to the repairs and the maintenance to the house, but he wasn't. Well, Ron then booked an official viewing with the realtor, a woman called June Nibert. She admitted that the house had been on the market for 2 years, but the only reason was because of a rumor that the home had bad floor joists. She assured the Johnsons this wasn't true. But seeing the full interior of the house was a shock. There really was a lot of work to be done, and even Nibert agreed that the place was a challenge. And perhaps that is what gave Ron the boldness to make his offer. Remember that the house was on the market for just under $60,000? Well, Ron offered to buy the place for $24,000. Surely such a dramatic drop would be an insult to the owner. But the real estate agent put the offer to them, and they came back with a counteroffer of $24,500. The Johnsons could not believe their luck. They had just snagged a house and a potential business with land for over half an already low asking price. They were excited with this bargain and never really thought about why the owner was so willing to let that house go. They spent the rest of that summer on house repairs so they could move in. The business part could wait for now. And yet they started to hit problems almost immediately. The phones wouldn't work. Wallpaper and paint wouldn't even stay on the wall. It would peel and bubble and blister. The electricians had huge problems rewiring the place. They kept saying their tools went missing. And when they ordered new items like fuse boxes or switches, they'd arrive smashed in the post. The TV cable guy even did something odd. Listen, he started to install everything, but then he handed the cable to Doretta to do the final hookup in the attic. She was confused why he wasn't doing it himself, and he just said, "Good luck, you don't pay me enough to go into your attic." She assumed he was just being rude and lazy, but later events would have her wondering. There were leaks and flickering lights, fresh plants in the garden would always die and wither, weird stains would appear. But then the real strangeness began. Doretta was half asleep in bed when she suddenly heard a scratching sound. It was coming from the attic, the place the cable guy would not go. She shook Ron awake, but he didn't hear the scratching. But when it happened a few nights later, he was the one who woke to it. And they figured that a bird must have gotten trapped up there. The next morning, Doretta saw a feather falling from the air vent in the ceiling, so they thought, it's confirmed there is a bird in this house. But it wasn't just one. You see, the family went to visit Ron's mother back in Louisville. But when they returned, they met with a horrific sight. They found some dead birds scattered on the floor of the house, and the walls were spattered with blood and other bits of gore from these animals. They must have gotten in through an open window and had died in panic trying to find a way out. They knew that this is what had happened because there was one bird still alive and it was still flying and it was slamming itself into the walls. It was an awful thing to see and it caused such a mess. However, it became especially disturbing when after the cleanup they could not find any windows or doors open, not even the attic door. How did the birds get in? The walls were so stained with blood that they had to repaint. Well, this growing parade of issues started to get to the family, and Doretta said that she, Ron, and Stephen were suddenly beset with headaches and new allergies. But at least Ashley, their youngest, seemed healthy, though she did start to exhibit some unsettling behavior. In the middle of the night, they would sometimes wake to hear Ashley laughing and talking, as if she was playing with someone in her room. And so Doretta would creep into the room to tell Ashley to, go back to sleep. But she'd find her little girl sitting up in bed with her arms out, like she was ready to hug someone who wasn't even there. This behavior was spooky, sure, but it would be the next incident that would plunge Doretta into all-out fear. Ron had been working late at the plant, and so Doretta was sitting, waiting up for him. She was watching TV alone. It was really late. It was about 2 a.m. And suddenly, she was startled out of her show by a hammering knock on the front door of the house. This was a shock, of course, but Doretta was not quite as scared as you and I might think. You see, she was aware that the building did still resemble a hotel, and she knew that some people may turn up here at all hours hoping for a room. And so she did open the door to see if it was somebody like that. But there was nobody there, just the dark night and an empty doorstep. Well, she went back to watch TV, but a few minutes later, the knocking came at the door again, only this time it was louder, and to her shock, she saw the door handle starting to move and rattle. Someone was trying to get in. She rushed to the window to look out to try and get a sight of this would-be intruder, but she saw nobody at the door. But then the banging on that door stopped, and after it she heard the sound of crisp leaves crunching underfoot as somebody walked off. Well, she was frightened for her safety, so she grabbed the phone to call the police. But the line was dead. Now, with no gun in the house, she rushed to the kitchen and grabbed a butcher knife. And she looked out of the window to see if the intruder might return. She saw something else instead. There was a woman and 2 boys walking up the road towards her house. And the closer they got, she started to realize it was somebody she knew. This woman was called Barbara Summers, and these were her sons. Barbara came to the door, she opened it, and she apologized. She said, "Look, we were driving down Clifty Drive just now in the car, and suddenly the car just rolled to a stop and died. And by the way, this happened just as we were passing your house, Doretta." Well, Doretta told them, "You better come inside," because she knew there was a prowler out there right now. Doretta told Barbara what had happened, but they all looked for signs of someone and they found nothing. Well, Barbara was understandably worried and wanted to call her husband for help, but Doretta explained, "Well, I'm sorry, the phones are out." Barbara just picked it up anyway, just in case, and she got a dial tone. and it was working fine now. She called her husband to take them back home, and when he did arrive and checked the car was fine too. What was going on? Well, after Barbara and her sons had gone home, Doretta went to check on the kids again. The thought of a potential prowler made her want to be near them. And during the renovations, Stephen and Ashley were sharing the same room, and so Doretta decided to stay in there with them just to protect them. She took the butcher knife for her protection. She got onto Ashley's bed and slid the knife between the mattress and the bed frame with the handle sticking out just in case she needed to grab it quickly. She would regret doing this, because after falling into a deep sleep, she woke with a feeling that she describes in the book as an extreme pressure on my jaw. She flicked her eyes open and couldn't believe her eyes. Her youngest, Ashley, who was only about a year and a half old at the time, was straddling Doretta's chest, and she had that kitchen knife in her hand, and she was pushing the tip of that blade into Doretta's mouth. It was absolutely horrifying. And the pressure that Doretta could feel was the blade pressing hard against the metal braces that she had on her teeth. She was wearing braces. Now, Ashley was trying to shove that knife past the braces, but she wasn't strong enough. She was just a little kid. Doretta wrote that if it hadn't been for those tooth braces, she would have had that knife shoved into the back of her throat. Well, Doretta grabbed the knife from Ashley, who fell backwards, screaming in fear. Stephen woke up at this noise and saw what had happened. Doretta calmed them both down and then rushed to return that knife to the kitchen. As you can imagine, she was deeply shaken by this incident, but at least the sun was coming up now. It had been what she described as a crazy night. And for weeks afterwards, Stephen stopped calling Ashley by her name and instead called her Lizzie Borden. Well, the bargain of a century was now turning into a money pit, and by Christmas it was clear that Doretta would have to go back to work to help pay for all of these renovations. She ended up working for the Coach House restaurant, which meant she was out working evenings, but at least she got home by midnight. Well, on one of those nights, she returned home knowing that the rest of the family were asleep in bed. And so she was startled to find that the screen door and the kitchen door had been wedged wide open. Now, Ron would never go to bed and leave the doors to the house open like that, especially in the winter. So she stomped into the bedroom, woke Ron up, told him off for leaving it wide open to burglars, particularly after what happened with the prowler before. He insisted he had closed that door and locked it too, as usual. Well, she was unnerved and a little annoyed, but she left Ron in bed, went down to make herself something to eat. And this is when something truly unsettling happened. While she was eating, she jumped. It was the sound of a car door slamming outside. She rushed to the window, tugged the curtains back just a touch to see who was out there, and she saw a man, and he was sitting inside her car. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. And she was about to race up to Ron to wake him for a second time. But just at that moment, a car came around the bend and the headlights, shone through the rear window of Doretta's car and out the front. And when that new light came, she could see that this man, if indeed it ever had been a man, was gone. Was this just her imagination? Was she seeing things? Am I okay? She thought. She let the curtain fall back and hurried up to bed. But something much worse was to come, and this time the figure would be inside the house. One day in 1988, Doretta was in the bathroom with Ashley, who was in the bathtub. Ashley was approaching 2 years old now, and she was standing in this tub filled with water, and in her hand she had a crayon made of soap, and she was drawing pictures on the tiles. Doretta sat on the edge of the bath just watching Ashley draw. As the bathwater sloshed around, it seemed like the most innocent of scenes. But then something happened that tipped that moment into sheer terror. The water had a lot of soap floating on the top, on the surface, white bubbles. But there were breaks in the soap where you could see through to the bottom of the bathtub. And as she sat there, Doretta just happened to look down at one of these breaks in the soap suds. and what she saw made the room suddenly tilt on its axis. She could clearly see the head and shoulders of a woman face down at the bottom of the bathtub. Ashley didn't see it, but she knew something was wrong because Doretta yanked her from the bath and ran into the hallway gasping in shock. And Ashley just kept asking, "What's wrong, Mummy? What's wrong?" Doretta had run so quickly that she hadn't thought to get Ashley a towel, and so the poor kid was standing there in the cold and dripping. And so Ashley decided she was going to have to go back into the bathroom to get a towel. It wasn't easy to step back into that room, but when she did, she saw nothing unusual, just the bath, the soap, the crayon bobbing on the water. Her mind was now racing, but she decided that she would not mention this to Ron because surely this was getting too much. What if she was having some kind of breakdown? First the man in the car and now a dead woman in the bath. Well, Ashley turned 2 in May of 1988, and for her birthday she got a talking doll for a present. The type that responds to your voice and says things. Ashley loved it and carried it everywhere she went, but that doll started to go off without anybody triggering it. She'd be in the house when suddenly Doretta would hear, "Mama, Mama, Mama." She'd find the doll with its little animatronic mouth moving over and over, and it would just not stop talking. And the thing wouldn't even shut up when it was switched off. Only when she pulled the batteries out did it stop talking. Unable to cope with its constant wailing, Doretta got rid of the doll. It did seem like strangeness was following Ashley around. For example, she wouldn't just get up in the middle of the night and talk in her room. Now she was starting to stroll around the dark house. She would grab food and go to the living room to watch TV, but the next morning, Doretta and Ron would always find 2 glasses of milk set out, 2 plates of cookies. They asked her about this, and that's when Ashley started talking about the little girl. She said she had a new friend in the home, Lisa. And this Lisa was coming into her room at night. Ashley said Lisa was sad because she had no home and no mother of her own. She also told them that Lisa lived in the attic. And not only that, she wasn't alone up there, Ashley said. There were others, and not all of them were friendly. One day, Doretta's sister came to visit. She hadn't seen Marilee for 7 years. And Doretta opened up about her experiences in this house, that she felt like she was going crazy. Now, Marilee was open to these sorts of things and reassured her sister and told her, don't assume that this is all in your head. What happens if this has a paranormal cause? And then Marilee asked Doretta, "Have you got a Ouija board?" Doretta nodded, saying they had bought one for Stephen a couple of years back. The family had all had a go with it, but nothing spooky had happened. Doretta assumed it was just a silly game with no power. Marilee said no, these things can work. And she said, "Go and get it right now. Maybe we can use the Ouija board to ask what is happening in this house." Doretta and Marilee sat facing one another in the candlelit room, their fingers resting on the planchette. It started to move just as soon as they began asking questions, and Doretta instantly assumed that Marilee must be pushing it. At one point, Marilee asked the spirit of the board if it knew their mother, a woman who had caused both of them extreme damage. And when she asked that, the planchette shot off the board and fell to the floor. Did Marilee flick that? Doretta wondered. Well, they picked it up, tried again, taking a different line of questioning. They asked what the name of this spirit was. It said CK. When they asked how CK had died, the response was MURDER. Murder. Marilee asked the board if it liked the members of the Johnson family. She went through one by one, and it didn't move, until she said, "Do you like Doretta?" And it quickly answered, N-O, no. And then something very strange happened indeed. Marilee suddenly shouted during this Ouija session, "You pervert! and the pointer shot off the board. Marilee's face was grave and serious, and she said, "I don't know why I just said that. It just burst out at me." At this point, Doretta started to feel uncomfortable too, and they closed up that board, put it away. When a hairdryer burst into flames the next day and a series of light bulbs exploded, Marilee begged Doretta to get her family out of that house. And yet, Doretta was still telling herself these things have got to have a natural explanation. Who knows, they thought. Ron was working at the electrical plant. Could he be bringing some kind of charge back with him that was causing the strange electricity issues in the house? And yet the activity just got worse and worse. One morning, Doretta found horrific-looking bruises all over Stephen's back, chest, and arms. He didn't know how they'd got there, and the doctor's visit didn't help them understand either. Didn't seem to be internal or anything, and they knew they hadn't done it. Besides, those bruises faded shockingly quickly and never came back. The Johnson family was starting to realize they really did need to get more income coming into the house, and so Doretta quit her job, and instead she started to train as an accountant, and she took up accountancy classes. And while she was studying in the house late one night, she got her papers there in the kitchen, and she looked up from her papers and she saw in the doorway the shape of somebody quickly jumping out of sight. She ran to the hallway to see which of her kids had been spying on her for fun, but everyone was in bed fast asleep. The children also started to see these figures out of the corner of their eye. Doretta even saw a little girl walking in the house. Could that be Lisa, the friend of Ashley? Or was she just losing her mind? That's what Ron started to think. He was just thinking that the pressure of life was making Doretta see things. Though it did get rather creepy when one of her relatives from Rineyville, Kentucky called on the phone one day. This cousin called Jenny said she'd been trying to call Doretta for 3 weeks, but the phone was always answered by a little girl who insisted that Doretta and Ron were not there. But Ashley hadn't been answering the phone at all. Who was that then, speaking to that cousin? A few nights after, Ashley woke up screaming in the middle of the night, and Doretta rushed in, and when she did, she heard banging sounds coming from the attic. And meanwhile, Ashley was screaming out the strangest things. She was shouting, "He's hurting her! He's hitting her! Make him stop!" Things started going missing in the house, or moving around, from wedding rings to even their marriage license. Listen to this. She was doing some of her accountancy work one time, and she opened up her accountancy textbook and found the marriage license in there. Now, things were getting very strained between her and Ron, and she wondered, did he put the license in here as some sort of cruel hint or something? But he denied it. And this made Doretta worry. Was she having blackouts and moving things around the house and maybe forgetting? If she thought she might be losing it, well, what happened next made things much worse. She went to the convenience store one day. She just parked up when another car, a blue one, pulled up alongside her. When Doretta looked across, she froze in shock. There was a woman behind the wheel of that car, and that woman was staring at Doretta and smiling. But the crazy part is that woman looked exactly like Doretta. I mean, identical. A mirror image, just staring at her with this awful wide smile. And then the woman lowered her head and drove off. This was the moment when Doretta became seriously scared for her own mental well-being. And she started to realize, I must be having some kind of nervous collapse, especially when she saw this woman who looked just like her on a few further occasions. Well, she did have medical tests to check if she may have some kind of brain tumor that could be affecting her, because at one point she lost her eyesight and they wondered if that could be it. But everything came back normal. Well, the house continued to be a huge challenge, not just to renovate, but to live in. For example, there was a period of wasp and ant infestations that just really made life difficult. And the strain was really getting felt on Doretta and Ron's marriage. They'd become so detached from one another through this that one day Doretta told Ron that she wanted a divorce. He said if she did, he would take the children. And then later he added something much colder. He looked at Doretta and he said, "If you ever have an affair, I would, without hesitation, kill the other man." She was shocked at this. But he said, "Look, I would do that and it wouldn't bother me because, quote, I don't have a conscience." This was totally confusing because Doretta knew this was not like him at all. And yet not long after, Ron had a run-in with Stephen. He was 15 years old at the time, and they had an issue over something trivial, something to do with a water valve for the shower. But Ron absolutely flipped out and started hitting Stephen, who was now old enough to hit back. When Doretta tried to separate them both, Ron pushed her into the living room. Stephen had bruises on him afterwards, and he had to go to Louisville for a few days to stay with their grandfather. Ron could barely remember the incident. It was a shocking and worrying development. Doretta's sister Nancy had been released from Madison State Hospital 4 years earlier, but Doretta found out that she and her children were living in a shelter in Madison. It wasn't the ideal time at all, but Doretta knew the right thing to do was to invite her sister and kids to live with them for a while, until she got back on her feet. Yet only a few days passed before Nancy's family began to experience things in the house too. For example, one of Nancy's children, who were called Jessica. She started screaming in the dead of night. When they rushed in to check what was wrong, she said she had just seen a horrible old woman standing at the foot of little Ashley's bed. Well, Stephen then started to exhibit the same kind of moody anger outbursts as Ron. On one occasion, he'd asked to do something and Doretta said no, and that argument got so bad that he actually grabbed Doretta, his own mother, lifted her, and threw her into the living room. But then he leapt on top of her chest with his eyes raging. She pleaded with him to stop and kept telling him she loved him, and she loved him, and she loved him, and eventually that seemed to break through and he stopped. The next day, she passed Stephen in the house, and he just happened to notice her bruises, and he said, "Mom, what happened to you?" He had no memory of what he had done, just like Ron. When she told him, Stephen was absolutely mortified and told her that if I did that, you need to get me locked up now. But then Doretta started acting aggressively towards Nancy. At one point, Doretta found herself grabbing Nancy by the throat and trying to lift her off the floor. Ron's temper got worse and worse. At one point, he even smacked Doretta in the face, splitting her lip and snapping her head back against the wall. Surely that would spell the end of their marriage. And indeed, he did leave the next day and drove to Louisville to stay with his mother. But the distance from the house seemed to make him like his old self again. And they spoke at length on the phone, saying they wanted to make things work, but they would have to have couples therapy. And so he came home. Once he was back, things started to improve in the relationship, and one night they decided to rekindle their romance with wine. But they were rudely interrupted by the fire alarm going off. They were drinking the wine downstairs at the time, but they had to rush upstairs to check where this black smoke was billowing from. It was coming from their bedroom. Now, Doretta didn't know this, but Ron had put flowers in the bedroom and lit 2 candles, ready for them when they eventually went up there. A romantic gesture that seems to have gone badly wrong. And they managed to get the kids to safety, and the fire department rushed to the scene. Yet they were puzzled by what had caused the fire in the end. Sure, it seemed like the candles, lit, were the obvious choice. Yet how did the bedding catch fire when the candles remained upright? It didn't make sense. And yet that room was destroyed by fire. The house reeked of smoke the next day, and the carpets throughout the house had been ruined by that smell. But they were able to arrange for repairs and replacements through insurance. But on that same day, Stephen came in, and he was not impressed. He said, "Mom, I have a bone to pick with you." And she's like, "What's wrong?" He says, "I have just been in the bathroom and I have found a lit cigarette just lying there on the bathroom rug. and it's already started to catch fire, so I put it out. And he said, this is ridiculous behavior. We just almost had the house burned down. You can't be doing this, Mom. This made absolutely no sense to Doretta. She hadn't been in the bathroom for hours. So even if she had dropped a lit cigarette, how could it still be burning without any further damage? She discussed this with Ron, and they started to worry. Could an intruder have been in the house and dropped it? Or could it even be the result of a deliberate arson attack? Is that what happened in the bedroom the other night? They had a family meeting and decided they would start locking the doors of the house. But Ashley said something unnerving in this meeting. She said, I know who started the fire. It was the people in the attic. They did it. They pressed her on this, and she said that there really were ghosts up there. A little girl with no mummy and an old man who was mad at us. He set the fire, she said. Well, later, Doretta and Ron discussed the theory of the house actually being haunted, and Doretta was getting more open to this, but despite them having a string of insanely bad luck, Ron was sure it was nothing more than just that. Well, the activity seemed to grow and develop. Like on the night of September 13th, 1991, Doretta had rented a movie from the video store, Postcards from the Edge. Stephen watched it with her, but he found it a bit boring, so he went to the bathroom instead. She stayed watching, feeling more relaxed than she had in ages, until she heard a strange rumbling sound coming from the room, almost like the growl of an animal. It went away, but then 10 minutes later it returned. This time it was undeniable. Something was growling in the room. Now, they'd heard many sounds in the house up until now, but never this. Stephen came rushing back into the living room saying, were you just clearing your throat now? I just heard something weird. So he'd heard it too. She said no. And as they were discussing what on earth this growling could be, the quiet of the room was suddenly invaded again, but this time a horrendous roaring sound came up from under the floor. It was so frightening that neither of them could bear to stay a second longer in the house, and after a moment of shocked paralysis, they ran for the car outside. They bundled into it, and Doretta sped off, crossing Clifty Drive. She writes, we were both crying and shaking. The fright had made us physically ill. Half a mile from our house, I pulled to the side of the road, and we both got out and vomited. They went to stay at Ron's mum's house that night, and she was skeptical, saying it must have just been an animal. They need to get an exterminator to flush it out. She even offered to pay for that. But Doretta and Stephen knew that was no animal. Well, after getting space at Ron's mother's, Doretta and Stephen headed back to the house. And when she walked into the laundry room and turned on the light, she couldn't believe it. There were letters painted on the wall, and the letters said C.K. These were the initials that the Ouija board had spelled out when they asked for the spirit's name. Well, Doretta knew that outside support was long overdue, and so she arranged to talk to the local priest. Clearly, Father Jeff found her story credible, because not only did he offer to come and bless the house, he said he could do it immediately. He brought a colleague with him too, and so the two priests moved from room to room in the house. They sprinkled holy water, they said prayers. When they were blessing the kitchen, the back door started rattling like someone was trying to get in. But then it opened and slammed shut, and it did that several more times. The priests stared at this in astonishment, saying, could this be the wind doing this? But it was a calm and still day outside. The priests said that the house really did have a spectral presence, but they were hopeful that after this blessing, it should be safe, though they encouraged Doretta to try and look into the history of the house. A week after the blessing, things in the house had not stopped at all. In fact, it seemed to escalate. One morning, Doretta saw a man standing in the doorway of the living room. He was wearing a coat and a bow tie, and she said this, it's quite chilling. He had a funny little smile and a comical oval face that reminded me of the Alfred E. Newman character in Mad magazine. Yeah, that's not something I want to see in my house. On another night, Stephen rushed into the living room where his parents and Ashley were. He said he'd just seen a figure in the hall, just by Ashley's bedroom. He said it was kind of a dark blob with a head and arms. When Ashley heard this, she said, "Ah, that's the old man. He's always around. He doesn't like us." And through all this, Doretta shivered because she had been seeing a similar figure in the house, standing in the corners and drifting across the rooms. One night, Doretta and Ron were in bed when Doretta felt pressure on her legs. She couldn't move. She told Ron, I can't move my legs. Something's going on. So he sat up to look at her, resting on his elbow like this. And he saw her nightgown. She felt it too. Her nightgown seemed to rise up like invisible hands were tugging to lift it. And just then she said she could feel cold fingers curling around and caressing her legs. Ron had finally seen something that he couldn't explain. And he just said, "What in the hell's this?" Then he saw another incident that challenged his denial. He was in the bathroom while Doretta was in the shower that hung above their bathtub. And while she was in there, she had this strange vision in her head of something with sharp fingernails trying to drag her down into blackness. It was such a shock that she cried out, but maybe it was just some sort of weird waking dream or something, which is when Ron looked over and gasped. The bottom of the bath was swimming with blood, and it was coming from Doretta's feet. They hurriedly checked the soles of those feet and found many small but really deep slits in them, as if something sharp had dug in. And no, there was no razor blade floating in the bottom of the bath. They checked that. Besides, the next morning, these claw-like marks were gone. Too much was happening now, and the visit from the priests had frankly made things worse. And so the time had come to take her sister's suggestion. You see, she had been encouraging the family to speak to a psychic, a man called Jordan Pitkoff. And so Doretta was ready to book him for an initial consultation fee. Ron almost choked at the price. It was $250, which was a lot back in the early 1990s. But she was insistent the time for burying their heads in the sand was over, and she booked the session. In the session, Jordan advised that the Johnsons should not send the kids to live somewhere else. He said it was very important for them to stay as a family unit because that would provide the right positive energy to defeat this thing. A house visit was arranged for a few days' time. Until then, the Johnsons were instructed to gather each night in a circle as a family to pray the Lord's Prayer. And when they did this, the back doors of the house would start to slam. They would even hear animals outside, like dogs and cats, barking and howling, but there was no sign of any animals when they checked. Those days leading up to the Pitkoff visit were intense, with more and more activity. There was one particularly terrifying moment when Doretta saw something in the bathroom. She saw, while in there, a man attacking a woman in the bathtub, while a little girl was crying out for him to stop. The woman she knew was his wife. After drowning her, Doretta watched this man, whether it was in front of her or in this weird vision of her mind, but she watched this man drag the body of the wife out of the bathtub, across the bathroom floor, and into a hole in the floor. And he shoved the body through it. And then, and this was horrendous to have to witness, she saw the man take a shovel and he slammed it into his daughter's face. Her dead body, crushed, was also dragged to the hole and dumped. And then the room just seemed to return to normal. What had she just experienced? A vision? A ghost? A memory? A prediction? Well, Jordan Pitkoff arrived with his assistant, Terry, and after a thorough walkthrough of the house, they confirmed what Ashley had been saying. They believed this house was occupied by multiple spirits, including a female child, various women, and a man. But it was Ashley's bedroom that was the worst. He said there were several malignant presences in that room and that they should close that room off and never use it again. Jordan also told the family to play cassettes of Gregorian religious chants in the house. Not just there, in their cars too. He told them, "It will try to provoke you. Ignore it. Don't get upset, and under no circumstances should you try to communicate with it." Well, the poltergeist activity continued, and Ron was finally talking about this as an actual haunting rather than just a product of his wife's overwhelmed psyche. But then Jordan had a rather unusual instruction. He told Doretta to come to his house, but to bring lots of photographs of her male relatives. He wanted to look through them to see if one of them could be the spirit in the house. She was confused by this, but intrigued, so she took a pile of photographs, and she decided, both Ron and her, to put Jordan to the test. She slipped in a bunch of random pictures of men, like some friends of Ron's. And if Jordan pointed at one of them and said, "Aha, that's your brother or your father," they would know he was fake, or at least limited in his abilities. And yet, after carefully looking through the many photographs she took, Jordan centered on one shot, and he said, "This man hurt you, didn't he, when you were young?" She stared in shock. By the way, this next part could be triggering for some people, but I'm only going to talk about it for about 30 seconds. He was pointing at an old photograph of her uncle, Ross. I'm not going to go into the story about what Uncle Ross did. The details are a little bit too much for a YouTube video, but the bottom line is, and you can find out all if you read her book, but Uncle Ross did indeed hurt her when she was young, sexually, and she had been traumatized by the things he had done, including one night when she woke in bed to find Uncle Ross crouching on the floor lifting her nightgown. Wasn't that exactly what her and Ron had witnessed in the bed the other night? Could he really be the presence that was tormenting her family now? It was a really disturbing thought. The poltergeist activity continued in the house, but they were also starting to hear voices through the radio and the television. Jordan said that these voices were the spirits of the dead trying to break through to her. Now, of course, they had seriously considered leaving the house, and people out there might be thinking, surely you would have just left by now. But there was a huge problem. They doubted they could sell the place. The home had been such a challenge to renovate. Remember, it had been on the market for like 2 years before. And they'd plowed so much money into the place that they could hardly take a financial hit on this house and then just leave it and buy or rent even a second property. Besides, the activity was starting to happen away from the home too. Like one night in the car when she and Ron were on the highway, Doretta was driving, and at one point she could sense that Ron was looking at her from the passenger seat. She turned to see him, gazing at her with affection. They'd been through so much. "I love you," he said. She smiled at him, turned back to the road, thankful that they were starting to connect again. A few minutes passed before she felt that exact same feeling again. Ron must be looking, and so she turned back to see him and was horrified. Ron was facing the road ahead. He wasn't looking at her at all, but something was. Doretta saw a black male figure literally sitting on Ron's lap, and it was staring at her with its head cocked to the side. And she then saw this figure sink and merge into Ron's body. She told him, "There's one in the car. It just went inside you." Back home, the loving Ron was gone. He erupted in furious anger. He started stomping from room to room behind her, following Doretta and shouting at her, saying that he was sick of all of this ghost talk, that he was blaming her for his exhaustion, his lack of sleep. And every time he berated her, she replied with Ron, "I love you," like she'd done with Stephen the other day. And in time, he calmed down. And then when Ashley woke one night screaming that something was biting her, she slept. It was the last straw. And against Jordan Pitkoff's advice, they arranged for both Ashley and Stephen to stay somewhere else for a while Ron and Doretta stayed on in the house. Well, it came as something of a surprise when there was a knock at the door one day. Standing there was one of the priests who had blessed the house. He hadn't spoken to her since the exorcism several weeks earlier. Now, a little background. During this haunting, Doretta had written a letter to Ed and Lorraine Warren, the famous yet controversial paranormal investigators. Lorraine had listened to Doretta's story and told her outright she believed the house was infested with demons, not ghosts. Well, the priest was at the door to say that they had just had a phone call from the Archbishop of Lafayette. Lorraine Warren had called the Archbishop requesting an exorcism on the Johnsons' property. The Archbishop spoke to his superiors who agreed. The exorcist was called Father A, and he called her on the phone one night to prepare for this exorcism. And if she was expecting him to bring comfort and support, she was hugely disappointed, because Father A was rude on the phone, almost mocking her lack of faith. He said stuff like, "A good Catholic wouldn't be in your predicament," and Your family is going to pay for your sins. He berated her for not going to church and was disgusted when she said that they had been using a psychic, Jordan Pitkoff. He mocked her children for being born out of wedlock too. This conversation left Doretta in tears, but what else could she do? Father A insisted that the only way to rid the house of evil was through a church-sanctioned exorcism. Lorraine Warren had said it was a demonic infestation, and he was offering, apparently, the solution. He called almost every night after that, discussing the case at length. And then finally they picked a date for the exorcism. But in preparation, Father A insisted that the children be baptized. He also said that her and Ron would have to get officially married in a church, because this would mean the kids would no longer be classified as, in his terms, illegitimate. She hated how she was being bossed around, but what other hope did they have, apart from Jordan? Besides, the activity was getting way too intense now. In fact, Ashley woke up choking, saying there was a snake wrapped around her throat, coiled around it. And the family decided enough was enough. They all needed to get out, until the exorcism happened. And they didn't have money to spare, but they rented out a small apartment in a bad part of town, and they left the house, and they could return when the exorcism was complete. But even moving out didn't make any difference, because the presence of the place seemed to follow them, and it would lead to a night that would turn this already awful haunting into a genuinely deadly nightmare. Ron was at work when he got the call. Stephen had been driving his car and had gotten into a terrible accident. And so Doretta rushed to the hospital and Ron followed after. They found Stephen in a hospital bed, his neck locked into a brace. He was covered in blood, and when he saw them, he just burst into tears. Now, thankfully, he had no major injuries, and they suspected that he would be okay. But someone else had been involved in the crash, and they were dead. It was just horrible, especially when Doretta could see the grieving family in the waiting room where she was. The man who had died was only 28 years old, and in the book, she names him as Charles Claudel. I don't know for certain if that's a pseudonym or if it's his actual name. Stephen said that he was driving when the accelerator pedal suddenly shot to the floor without him doing it, and he tried desperately to stop it, but he couldn't. He crashed, flipped the car 3 times, and slammed into a pickup truck. Charles Claudel was driving that truck with others in the car. Charles was thrown from his vehicle and killed, while the 2 passengers in the pickup truck, well, they only sustained minor injuries. Stephen was, as you can imagine, racked with guilt, and he wanted to speak to Jordan Pitkoff about it. Stephen was convinced that the presence from the house had tried to kill him, and yet somehow it had ended up killing this stranger instead. I cannot even imagine how Stephen felt, but Doretta writes that her son just wept and wept over this, and she too nearly fell apart with this development as well. And remember that at this point they weren't even staying in the house anymore. They were living in an apartment waiting for the exorcism to happen. Was there just going to be no escape from this? Well, the exorcist, Father A, got in touch, and he said that because of this car accident and the death, the church decided to hold back from being involved for now. The exorcism would have to be postponed until the verdict was made about Stephen's involvement. They didn't want to become embroiled in the scandal. Doretta had the impression that beneath Father A's arrogance and coldness, he may well have just been too scared to come to the house, especially after news of this crash. They had nowhere else to turn, so they spoke to Jordan again, and he suggested that he and some of his assistants carry out a lay exorcism that coming Sunday. Exhausted by it all, Doretta just said, "Okay, do it." The ritual took place that Saturday, and afterwards Jordan said that the presence was weakened, but not removed. In the next few days, the apartment in Kent where they were staying was indeed quite quiet. Yet Doretta could just tell the presence was holding back, waiting to pounce like an animal. And sure enough, the activity started up again. When it did, Doretta said she'd had enough. She became dissatisfied with Jordan's involvement. Nothing seemed to be working. And she said that she wanted to get out of Indiana completely. But before that happened, She began reading all the books she could on the paranormal, and after contacting the publishers of several, she was put in touch with Dr. William G. Roll. He was a respected academic from the psychology department of West Georgia College, and Roll had a special interest in the paranormal, but especially in the topic of PK-related phenomenon, that is, poltergeist activity produced by psychokinesis. Psychokinesis being the ability of someone's intense human emotions or things in the mind or the stress of that to unleash physical effects on the environment, which we might often call poltergeist activity. In other words, could the haunting not be coming from ghosts at all, but from the people themselves? Doretta started to wonder, what if one of the family, herself particularly, were in some ways responsible for this? This idea seemed to be confirmed when they moved again to an apartment in Louisville, because the paranormal activity started to show itself there too. So it didn't necessarily seem just tied to the house. They heard scratching behind the walls and objects vanished and reappeared. When they were throwing a birthday party for Ashley, the balloons started to float around the room in an extremely odd way, but then suddenly they heard a horrendous wailing scream from just outside of their balcony. And it sounded unlike any human or animal they had heard before. But there was a sense of growing evil around the family, one that even threatened the life of young Ashley. Listen to this. One day, Doretta was sitting with Ashley in the rented apartment. Her daughter looked fine and in good spirits, and they were getting ready to visit Granddad's house, so Doretta carried on with what she was doing, which is packing. But just a few minutes later, Doretta was shocked when the apartment door plunged open and Ashley came staggering in. How did she even get outside? Well, she set that question aside for now, because Doretta then saw the blood. Blood was glistening around Ashley's throat and shirt collar. She rushed over and screamed for Ron to come, and they both found a clear cut on their little girl's neck. It wasn't that deep, but it was enough to break the skin. And she said, "Ashley, what happened? What happened?" Ashley was sobbing, and all she could say was that she had hung from a tree. And at this, Ron ran outside to the large tree that stood outside in their apartment building in the courtyard. And sure enough, he saw a long, thin silver cord hanging from one of the branches. It looked like it had been cut off at the end. As he was staring at this in horror, just imagining the scene of what could have happened, a voice came from behind him. He turned round, and one of their neighbors coming up. Neighbor said, "Are you the little girl's father?" He said, "Yes. Did you see something?" This neighbor said that he had been in his apartment watching TV with the balcony doors open when he heard what he thought was a cat screaming outside. He rushed to the window and was horrified to see a little girl dangling from the tree. This man yelled for his wife to bring him a knife, and with the knife he sprinted to the tree and cut the cord. But it took him a while, because he said the cord was just coiled around and around her neck over and over like a snake. Well, they rushed Ashley to the hospital, and understandably the staff had serious concerns. But Ashley kept just saying, "Look, I was playing in the tree when I just got tied up accidentally in this cord." They x-rayed her neck, and for a while they thought she might have broken it, but actually it turned out there was just a bit of blood pooling in the x-ray. But the staff were astonished when only 1 week after this incident, all of the marks on Ashley's neck had healed. Well, it was 1992 when Dr. William Roll got back in touch with Doretta. Remember, he's this parapsychologist who specialized in psychokinesis in poltergeist cases. And he offered to come to the house to help with the case, but his time wasn't free. He estimated his fee would be around $2,000, about $200 a day plus expenses. And Doretta was heartbroken at this. There was just no way they could afford that. So Roll had an idea. He said, "Well, why don't I get a TV company or a network to film this? And that might mean the studio could pay for my time and not you." Now, at first, Doretta refused point blank. She did not want publicity, and she hung up. But then she mentioned this to Marilee, her sister, and Marilee was furious. She hit the roof. She said, "You've gone beyond the luxury of privacy now. Your family are in peril. This is all you've got. This is your only option." And so she picked up the phone, called Roll back, and told him, "Okay, go ahead. See if you can get the TV deal. Just please help us." A few days later, Roll called back. The Fox television network were ready to send a crew over to film the Johnsons' family story. It would be for a segment in a show called Sightings, and the network did say they would pay Roll's expenses. Well, on June 25th of 1992, the Sightings crew came to Madison. They all stayed in the Hillside Inn, and so did Doretta, and while there, Roll was able to talk to Doretta in depth. He was particularly interested in how the activity seemed to increase when the church became involved. Roll had a very fascinating idea, suggesting that the ideas they were putting into Doretta's head were influencing the haunting. In other words, he wondered if, for example, when the church called it demonic, it became demonic. Roll was more and more convinced that Doretta was unleashing the paranormal activity with involuntary psychokinesis. Well, the filming for the Sightings episode began at the house, starting with a session where 3 mediums attempted to contact the spirits of the house. Doretta and Ron were astonished by how accurate they were. However, the producer of the show, Joe Day, was desperate to capture ghostly activity on camera. He asked what activities seemed to rile the spirits, and Doretta and Ron said, like, when we play those Gregorian chant tapes, that freaks them out. When we open up a can of paint, that seems to freak them out for some reason. And so Joe Day started doing all of these things to provoke the activity. He bought a bunch of tapes and was playing them. He got some paint, opened it, painted a large peace sign on the wall. Nothing happened. And so Joe started striding around the house, demanding the presence show itself, saying things like, and this is a direct quote, "Show yourself, you pencil dick bastard. Come out and face me if you've got the guts." William Roll was not impressed by this, and he said to Joe, "You've got to be careful here. This is not a game." Well, it was 4:17 a.m. when something did indeed show itself. It happened when Doretta was sitting in the kitchen, exhausted. She looked up, and she saw a male entity standing in the kitchen doorway, and it was slowly moving towards her. And of course, she was frightened at first, but very quickly, it turned to anger, and she spoke directly to the figure and said, "You've wrecked my life, but you're not even brave enough to show yourself on camera." When she said this, the dark figure seemed to start glowing with a kind of light, and at that very point, Stephen walked into the kitchen, and he saw the glowing figure too. In shock, he backed out of the kitchen and motioned to one of the cameramen, a man called Craig Heiberger. Curious, Craig came into the kitchen, and his mouth dropped in total astonishment. He could see the glowing figure too. And for a moment, he just stared at this thing, but then he said, "Oh shit." He'd just been outside of the house, and he had left his camera out there. Now, the rest of the house could hear some sort of commotion happening in the kitchen, and they all raced to see what was going on. But leading the way was Joe Day, the producer, and he burst into the room with his camera and a bright light shining, and he kept shouting, "Where is it? Where is it?" He saw nothing. Well, apart from the cameraman, Craig, who was standing there in total shock, who looked like he could burst into tears at any moment, and he just kept saying, "I can't believe it. I can't believe what my eyes have just seen." This was incredibly frustrating because Doretta said that if only Joe hadn't come barging in like he did, maybe he would have seen or even captured what they had seen. Annoyed, Joe had to settle for an on-camera interview with Craig. It's interesting to read how Doretta describes this producer, Joe. It can come across like he's just a brash person desperate for a great shot, which of course is partly true. He's trying to make a TV show. But she said that it wasn't just impatience. She felt it was fear. He was scared of the house. For example, at one point, he needed to use the bathroom in the home and told Doretta that he was too scared to go in there alone. She said, "Well, I'm not going in there with you." And he went, "Okay." And he was so desperate that he turned away from the bathroom and went out on the lawn instead and relieved himself out there. Even if he hadn't captured anything on film, something about that house did scare him. Well, the episode hadn't aired yet, but word got out locally that the Johnson family were going through this haunted house ordeal, which was actually quite liberating, Doretta said. You see, up until now, she had to keep things quiet, but now she felt able to be open about it all, which came as quite a relief. By the way, at this point, they were living back at the house. They just couldn't afford to keep renting an apartment while they still had this house. And Doretta was able to talk to more people about the home, including a woman who had previously lived there. Her name was Georgia Jeffries. She too had strange experiences in the house, but she also shared a disturbing bit of information. She told them that in the past a woman had died in the house, and she had deliberately taken too many pills. Doretta asked Georgia if she knew the name, and she said yes. She was called Caroline Kersey. Doretta was shocked. Remember CK, the initials that came through the Ouija board? The ones that were written on the wall of the laundry room? Doretta also asked where did this poor woman die, and when she heard the answer, her blood turned to ice. Caroline Kersey had done it in the bathroom, and she had died in the bathtub. Doretta's mind raced back to that moment when she saw through the soap on the bathwater a woman lying face down in the bathtub. Was that the tragic Caroline Kersey, still under the water after all these years? Well, their segment on Sightings was broadcast on July 31st, 1992, and I was able to track down the episode. It's not as simple to do that, to be honest, because the episode changed the name of the family, calling them the Kings, and they didn't even share the town in which it happened. So these things are not always easy to find. But still, it was fascinating to watch that back and see the Johnsons sharing their story at the time, backing each other up. And they've done this in a few different paranormal shows since, like Haunted Lives and Paranormal Encounter. But again, I don't really think the story is particularly well known. But anyway, with Sightings, they were pleased and relieved with how they came across. They were glad that the show hadn't presented them as weirdos or fame seekers. They had simply told the Johnson story, and they appreciated that. And this made them even more well-known in their local community, but also brought some unusual interest from further afield. Some people were getting in touch to ask if they could rent the house for the weekend in the hope of encountering ghosts. Now, sometimes skeptics of the paranormal would dismiss cases because they say, well, these witnesses are doing it for the fame and the money. That can be pretty presumptuous and a simplistic accusation, and naive too, when it comes to how much money people can make from these things. Remember that the Johnsons only allowed the show to be filmed because they couldn't afford William Roll's help. And just after the filming, they were in such dire straits that they had to apply for an equity loan against the house, meaning they borrowed money from the bank, and if they couldn't pay it back, the bank would take the house. This loan was going to be a huge help to them. But then the Sightings episode aired on July the 31st. A few days later, on August 4th, the vice president of the bank called them, saying they were going to withdraw the equity loan offer. Ron was shocked and asked, why are you going to withdraw it? And the response was simple. The guy at the bank said, because your house is haunted. So it wasn't like them being part of a TV episode was bringing them riches, far from it. It was making them worse off right now. But at least the production company was still paying for the travel expenses of Dr. William Roll. Roll was still coming out to visit Doretta from time to time to help her, and he wasn't charging the family for his time. Roll's view was very intriguing. He argued that Doretta herself was the real catalyst for the haunting. Yes, there had been activity there before she had moved there, so there was something in the house for sure, but he felt it was the combination of this house and Doretta which was creating such dramatic events. He wasn't blaming her, by the way. Rather, he was saying that the house was giving her images from the past. She was somehow seeing them and projecting them with her own psychic gifts. I know this sounds strange, but Roll was keen for her to be open-minded. He said that seeing the past is not as strange as it might sound. I mean, think about it. Think about it where you are right now. Look around your room and just look at something. The object you are looking at right now, you are not seeing that in the present. Do you realize that? You are seeing that object as it was 1/10,000,000th of a second ago. It just took time for your brain to process the light that had to travel to give you that image. It's the same principle with stars. You think you're seeing the stars shining now, but you're actually looking at what astronomers call ancient light. Light that's taken centuries, millions, or billions of years to reach us. Could Doretta be seeing those images from long ago and somehow making other people see them too? Well, Roll said that the key to it all would be to delve into Doretta's troubled past and family history. Then, he believed, they could begin to heal the trauma that could be fueling this haunting. And they did this through hypnosis, and it was not an easy experience. Doretta's upbringing was filled with dysfunction and horrendous abuse from multiple people. And these were experiences that she had tried to avoid and bury, understandably, since the pain was so great. But Roll took her under, and together they walked through those dark chapters from her life. He did this by inviting her to observe her past trauma, as if watching it happen to another little girl. Though she was fully aware that this girl was her. And as she watched the horrors unfold, Doretta could tell that her own mother had hated her, that she had been complicit in the abuse she had experienced from others, and that her mum had abandoned her and left her in the care of a man who had beaten Doretta with a belt. It was really hard to do this, but after seeing the girl herself endure those grim experiences, Roll told Doretta this.
Look at that little girl again. Take her in your arms and hold her. You're strong and you can protect her. That little girl, Doretta, is no longer abandoned.
And then he added,
if you understand the hurt, it becomes healing.
And it did start to work. She began to accept her rightful anger about what had happened to her. And then, in February of 1993, Roll paid for Doretta to attend a special residential retreat in Georgia, and along with others who seemed to have psychic ability, she learned more about these gifts she had, and felt a sense of acceptance and community there. But crucially, she knew and learned that she was not to blame, not for what happened as a child and not for what happened in the house. And when the week's retreat was over, she felt so renewed with a wonderful sense of peace that she spoke to Ron, and they scraped together some money so he could go and experience the retreat for himself to learn more. They knew how important this was because the strain from the last few years had pushed them close to divorce. He came back from that week a different man. And Ron finally admitted in the years of the haunting he had had an affair with someone. Divorce seemed the only option, and yet Doretta felt there was space to find each other again. She writes, forgiveness is a part of maturing. I forgive myself, and I'm trying to forgive the man who says he loves me. And for what I've been able to see online, they are still together, and forgiveness seems to have happened. When both Ron and Doretta had addressed their inner turmoil, something changed, not only in them, but in the house. And she writes,
I don't remember ever being so happy, and that euphoria seemed to flow through the house and seep into the land.
They had tried to grow flowers in the yard there, but they would never take. But now, now the lilies, the rose bushes, the shrubs, they flourished. And the house itself, well, Ashley was no longer frightened of her bedroom, and Stephen was also able to finally have compassion on himself after that fatal accident. It wasn't idyllic. The house would still sometimes have strange activity like banging on doors, but nothing as great as it had been. And the ghosts, both in her house and in her heart, slowly began to fade. The People in the Attic is a fascinating book and is really worth reading. Doretta goes into far more detail, not only about the haunting itself, but the traumatic events that may have fed whatever stirred in that house. And I recommend you seek it out because I think her story just should be better known. She has told it in a few shows since, but they do seem to miss out so many important details. And when looking into this story, it can get confusing too, because a few years after the Sightings episode in 1996, Doretta's case was adapted into a made-for-TV movie called The Uninvited, also known as Victim of the Haunt or The Haunting of Patricia Johnson. It does stay faithful to some elements of the book, like the initial disbelief of Ron Johnson, here he's called Charles Johnson, but the film takes so many creative liberties, including a dramatic ending that seems more inspired by Tobe Hooper's film Poltergeist than the Johnsons' family actual experience. So you've got to bear all of this in mind if you look into this case. But the best source for her story is when she told it herself in this book. In the end, the house on Clifty Drive never really tried to prove anything. It just kept repeating itself, asking again and again for someone to look. And Doretta did look, not only at the spirits in those rooms, but into the shadows of her own past. And in doing so, she found a measure of peace at last. I do think there's something in that for us to ponder. To ask, what if a place can pick up the things we try to bury or discard? What if that house was less a paranormal prison and more a mirror with a mean streak, forcing her to see what still needed light? Because of this haunting, Doretta walked one careful step at a time through the haunted hallways of her memories, switching on lights that no one else could reach. And maybe that's the ending that hauntings hate the most. Not a Hollywood headline, not a perfect shot for a TV producer, but when a person finally names what hurt them, forgives what they can, and refuses to be defined by ghosts, whether of the past or the present. You know, the fog doesn't lift all at once, but be encouraged, because at least it thins. And in that slow, stubborn light, a life becomes a life again, and a house becomes a house again. And a person's story finally no longer controls them, but rather it falls rightly under the control of those who lived it. I'm Peter Laws, and you have been watching Into the Fog. Good night.